Welcome to the Campaign School podcast, produced by the Academy of the Impossible. And I'm Jesse Hirsch with Seb Fox Allen. And in this episode, we're going to go through a range of topics from Councillor Paul Ainsley, who visited us recently, to Ron Paul, and Google's attempt to introduce a bit more social media into the 2012 US presidential election coverage. But beginning with Councillor Paul Ainsley, he joined us to talk about some of his initiatives around increasing public participation in the process and encouraging civic engagement as well. And one of the reasons we invited Councillor Ainsley is because he is rather active on Twitter. I'm curious, Seb, if you were surprised to learn that he is a politician who tweets his own tweets, and whether you think that's the norm at City Hall and whether it helps someone like Councillor Paul Ainsley.
Well, I think it was very refreshing to hear from a candidate who would consider himself to be right of center be able to talk pretty frankly about the role of civic engagement. I think it's very easy for political participation to be politicized. You often hear those on the left sort of suggest that there's a secret plot involving redistricting to try and limit engagement on their side of the spectrum. You'll often also hear from people right who seem hesitant about voter engagement efforts based on the demographics that they perceive to be involved. And I think it was very interesting to be able to hear from someone on the right side of the spectrum, because we've heard so often from people on the left side of the spectrum that political engagement does not have to be a political issue, but rather is a fundamental core issue that any politician should be involved in.
And further, I think if one is in favor of political engagement and increased political participation, it automatically must include one's opponent's supporters as well as one's own, in that you can't be selective. And that's why I think it's interesting in the United States and the Republican primaries, the role that Ron Paul has played, both as a populist in terms of trying to bring new people into the political spectrum, but at the same time as a kind of dissident within the Republican Party who's critical of the process and perhaps even critical of the party establishment. That's definitely reflected in his supporters. So I'm curious, Seb, given that you've been following the U.S. election quite closely, if you have some thoughts on what's been happening quite recently in some of the smaller primaries vis-a-vis Ron Paul supporters versus the other Republican supporters.
Well, there's been a fascinating dynamic that's evolved ever since Mitt Romney has wrapped up being the presumptive nominee for the Republican Party. And it's a technique that Congressman Paul has been using called front-loading. Without delving too deep into the minutiae of party nominating procedure, front-loading essentially describes the practice of securing access to the internal channels of a given party's nomination process. So in Republican primaries, each state is afforded a total number of delegates based on population generally. And the results of the primaries and caucuses, these would be the elections that we've heard being reported on over the past couple of months, will decide the configuration of how many of these delegates go to candidate A and how many to candidate B, etc. Now, sort of the next stage of the process has the county and state committees essentially elect a physical person to represent each assigned delegate in each state. So, say in the case of Nevada, there would be 28 total delegates, and now there have been 28 people nominated to go to the Republican convention and register a representation of the primary result in their state. In Nevada's case, Mitt Romney, who finished with 50%, would have had 20 out of 28 of those delegates. But so what Ron Paul is doing, and not only in Nevada, but also a bunch of other states, Louisiana, Iowa, and even Mitt Romney's home state of Massachusetts, is organizing his supporters to be nominated as these physical delegates, which essentially opens up a whole range of ways for him and his supporters to either influence or, if they choose, disrupt the Republican convention in August.
Well, and it speaks both to the grassroots power that the Ron Paul campaign has traditionally held, but perhaps as well the semi autonomy. I mean, it may be even a mistake to ascribe Ron Paul with being responsible for this strategy, that it may just as likely be a spontaneous strategy that was developed by Ron Paul supporters themselves, who are perhaps not satisfied to allow the Republicans to have the exclusive monopoly on the way the which not just the nomination but the narrative, I think, around the election plays out, which is also interesting from the perspective of the Academy of the Impossible, in that we obviously are not just concerned with politics, but the field of communications in general, especially video games. And you stumbled upon an interesting Ron Paul video game that I think demonstrates the grassroots nature of his campaign and the supporters behind it. And granted, it may be coming a little late for the nomination process. It does present itself as an interesting type of propaganda or campaign tool that appeals to perhaps an entirely different demographic.
Well, definitely, it is an interesting example. The game itself is a 2D platformer um, that, from the video clip I've seen, seems to have Ron Paul manipulating crowds of people. It seems like Tea Party types from place to place, collecting different things. The creator decided to use Kickstarter, which is actually quite an unconventional way to build support for a project like that. And by all accounts, it's doing quite well. It seems to have raised about double of what he had initially asked for. I think it's an interesting example of how Ron Paul may be a placeholder for a lot of young libertarians who just see him as the best option to advance their viewpoint and aren't necessarily that connected to the cult of Ron Paul that we associate with his candidacy.
Well, and it's interesting too that you refer to Kickstarter perhaps as an unorthodox way of raising funds, but one that is becoming increasingly common, and that it's remarkable how what used to be novel is, even in this current election cycle, starting to become standardized. And in particular, it's interesting that Google is going to aggressively use their Hangout video conference, the module that's part of their Google Plus system, as a tool for journalists and media organizations to use as part of making their presidential election coverage that much more interactive. And it does suggest that perhaps social media, which was perhaps a novelty, 4 years ago when it comes to the journalism side, that our expectations are such that if the media don't use social media as part of their coverage, that will react rather skeptically. So I'm curious if you're anticipating whether this will A, be successful, or C, be appealing in terms of how, let's say, someone like yourself, who is a very active user of social media, both in consuming political information and sharing your analysis, whether there's anything that will appeal to you vis-a-vis some of the different media outlets and their use of this technology.
What I'm interested in seeing is, will the current dynamic, which has reporters still in many ways as a buffer between campaigns and voters, I wonder if that will start to erode. When we talk about these Hangouts, Google Hangouts, what immediately comes to my attention is the concept of the campaign a conference call, which happens with reporters almost every day, and generally the public doesn't have very good access to. If there's a way that social media can make those kinds of conversations more accessible to voters, then I think that would be a more interesting shift than simply seeing the number of tweets related to the election multiply.
I think that's a good point, and it does suggest that there's an inherent evolutionary model to certainly internet, but especially social media platforms, and that we expect that evolution to happen. That if they keep doing things the way that they did things last time, there tends to be a short patience, and we'll switch the channel, and often that could be to an amateur channel. I mean, I'm curious if our good friends at Truth Mashup and their podcast will provide us with interesting fodder of the way social media can and will be used innovatively to cover the election, rather than just say exclusively look at the bigs. But with that said, I'm also looking forward to our next campaign school event on special night, Thursday, May 17th, with Alan Gregg, who's going to talk not just about the polling and the punditry that happens around election, but I suspect he too will get into the way in which journalism and social media journalism in particular is having an impact on political campaigns. So I certainly invite our listeners to come to the Academy for that event, and we'll certainly talk about it here on the podcast. So thanks again, Seb, for another fun conversation, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Jesse.